Where shall we start then, Harley? There's obviously a lot going on the global stage at the moment. The Trump impeachment.
I would start with that, the coup in the United States, and connect it also to what they're doing in Britain to try and stop the anti-Brexit forces that are trying to turn back the clock on the whole rebellion.
Lead us into that then. We've got the Russiagate obviously failed, and now we see Trump under attack again with this Ukrainian issue, Joe Biden, etc., etc.
Yeah.
To those of us who have looked into this issue, even scratching a little bit just beneath the surface, it seems that there's clearly not a case for impeachment.
All right. Well, I think the first of all, the coup is continuing. The regime change coup did not stop with the collapse of the Mueller investigation. But it's worth noting that the Mueller investigation did collapse. They're still trying to keep it alive in Nadler and the House and certain other people. But they realize it's a no-go. The population doesn't buy it. The population doesn't think Trump was involved in actions against the United States working with Putin. So then they tried the Trump is a racist, a white nationalist line. That wasn't going anywhere either. They went so far as to say Trump was the cause of these mass shootings that took place, when in fact one of the mass shooters cited green arguments for why he had to take out Mexicans. So that didn't work. So what are they doing now? They're going back to the heart of the Russiagate story, because a lot of Russiagate came out of Ukraine. And who was the point man for the Obama administration in Ukraine? It was Joe Biden. Yeah. So while it's worthwhile to point out that Hunter Biden's role with Burisma is questionable, that there probably was an investigation underway of this that was stopped particularly by Joe Biden. But the bigger issue is, what was the coup in Kiev in February 2014? What was the intent of that? It was to prevent any U.S.-Russian rapprochement. And when Trump came in as president, what was one of the first things he said? We're going to have good, friendly relations with Russia. What's wrong with that? Why shouldn't we cooperate with Russia? So even before Trump, the establishment, and by establishment, what we at LaRouche PAC mean is the British Empire, or the deep state in the United States, is a collaboration between U.S. intelligence and British intelligence. Their whole policy was a commitment to the old geopolitics of the Bush and Obama period. And the coup in Ukraine, following the coup in Libya, was a part of that regime change.
Okay, can I just to clarify for anybody that doesn't realise, so that you're referring there to the power strings extending from London and the old British Empire establishment in collusion with the American secret services, the sort of deep state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, to make the connection more clear, since 2001, since 9/11. Who's been the leading intelligence source that's led the United States around by the nose? Most people don't realize this. Tony Blair played a huge role in convincing Bush that the British had the documentation of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. I mean, just the other day, Joe Wilson, the ambassador, passed away. Wilson was the one who debunked the British line that Saddam was buying yellow cake uranium from Niger. Mm-hmm. The British passed that to the U.S. Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6, created the original dirty dossier, which said that Saddam has weapons that can hit London within 45 minutes with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And this was picked up by Colin Powell and brought before the UN. Libya, it was the British who were taking the lead on that, and they brought Obama along with them. That's not to say Obama wouldn't have done it. Obama has very deep connections to this British intelligence network, especially through the people around him, like John Brennan. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about the British Empire, we include what people call the shadow government or the deep state or the military-industrial complex in the United States. The British line for years was American brawn and British brains after World War II. Now, I don't know about the British brains, and we're now seeing the American brawn collapsing. But this is the empire, which is based on what? Finance.
Right.
And if you have an emerging new option in Eurasia with Russia, China, India, Japan, South Korea around the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a threat to the old transatlantic establishment. And so going back to the time of the Libya coup, because remember, the Russians were told, oh, don't worry, we're not going to take out Gaddafi. This is just an operation to save some people. And Putin made the point he's never going to fall for those lines again. But the Libya coup was aimed at Russia. The operations in Syria, which included extensive U.S. support for terrorists, was aimed at Russia and Iran secondarily.
Yeah.
And we know the Ukrainian coup is the same thing. So Biden was key in the coup in Ukraine, which combined U.S. neoconservatives, British intelligence. You know who was in Kiev through most of 2014? Christopher Steele.
Okay.
He wrote 100 memos that were sent to the State Department to Jonathan Weiner, who's one of the people who behind the scenes was involved in Russiagate, who provided them to Victoria Nuland, who was the one who bragged that the U.S. spent $5 billion to overthrow the Ukrainian government. So this is what Biden was in there to protect. And, you know, whether his son was illegally taking money or involved in a corrupt operation, probably yes.
But it sounds like that's a secondary issue from what you're saying.
And Biden did brag that he shut down the investigation by threatening to withhold money, which is exactly what they're now saying is what Trump was trying to do, even though the actual transcript shows that Trump never threatened to withhold funds from Ukraine if they didn't give him dirt on Biden.
Yeah.
But people shouldn't get caught up in the simple corruption. It's always there. But the deeper corruption was the coup in Ukraine aimed a new dagger at Putin. Yeah. And Putin outflanked them. And that's why when Trump got elected, they had to go with Russiagate to prevent a Trump-Putin alliance that would include Xi Jinping, which could include the United States moving away from a collapsing financial system. And so I think that's the real story. And if Trump tells that story and gets it out, which is hard because of the media control and also because of the complete shameless lying of the Democrats and also the weak support from a lot of the Republicans, it's going to be a huge fight in the United States. But you have the same thing there in the United Kingdom with the alliance against Brexit, the changing of the goalposts, the changing of the rules. You know, and I'm not a big fan of Boris Johnson, but he's sticking to the fact that you voted for this and this is what we're going to do. Sure.
Well, maybe I can just interject there, Harley, because when some of us onlookers see things like, you know, this sort of maneuver towards, you know, nearly war with Iran, you know, and all this posturing, how much is Trump involved with that? Because that sort of discredits him in the eyes of people who are trying to understand just this message that you're sharing with us now, and understand his struggles with trying to deepen his a more effective relationship with the Russians. And then we see these shenanigans. I mean, obviously he's got rid of Bolton now, and so he you know, he's made things maybe a bit easier for himself this summer. But how does that play into this bigger picture when we see this sort of aggression pointed at Iran? Is that coming from Trump or from other factors of his administration?
Look, Trump is a complex person, and it's difficult to know exactly what's going on inside his own head, except if you see that he's been consistent, that he doesn't want to get involved in wars. He's opposed to regime change wars. He stopped the potential for a war with Iran. He said he's willing to meet with Rouhani. And you pointed out Bolton, people like Bolton and Dan Coates, and before that McMaster and John Kelly, these were all people who were prepared to go to war over Iran. What Trump underestimated is the extent to which the swamp dominates Washington. He said, drain the swamp. He said, no regime change wars. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to waste American resources in endless wars. He said, no sane president supports endless wars. And then what does he find? You can't find foreign policy advisors who aren't supporters of endless wars. What in the old days would be called British geopolitics. You know, the idea that you have to pit states against each other and East versus West, North versus South. so that you can have a predominant power govern the world. That's old geopolitics, the great game in the 19th century, the carving up of the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and so on. So Trump underestimated these things. And he, in an attempt to buy some time, brought in some of the neocons.
Right.
Now, Bolton clearly was opposed to virtually everything Trump was trying to do. Bolton personally sabotaged the North Korean negotiations at the second summit in Hanoi. Bolton has been calling for a war with Iran for 20 years. Bolton was the one who stepped forward when the drone was shot down and said he had ordered the USS carrier group, Abe Lincoln, to go to the Persian Gulf. Well, Bolton's not the president. And Trump finally, tired of that, got rid of Bolton, got rid of Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, who was another bad guy. And now the fear in Washington is that Trump has the hand to control foreign policy.
Right.
And so with the end of the Mueller threat, the failure to stop him on the white nationalism and these other lines, Trump was taking the initiative. At the Osaka G7 meeting, he met with Putin. He met with Xi Jinping. Then he went to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un. He was moving in a concerted direction to follow through on his campaign promises. Now, it's in that point you asked the question about Iran. I think if it were up to Trump, he would sit down again with the Europeans and say, yes, we're going to renegotiate this. We'll eventually lift the sanctions. Just as he said he was prepared to lift some of the sanctions with North Korea as a step-by-step approach. And it was sabotaged. And so I don't think Trump wants to get involved in a war, especially since he promised his base there would be no more wars. But he's up against a very formidable opponent. Now, the other point on that is that that's why the Ukraine situation has popped up, because they're doing everything they can now to have a regime change in the United States.
Yeah. Can I just zoom out just a moment here, Harley? Sure. To those people who would argue that isn't Trump just a puppet like all of these other politicians, you know, out there, and these people that are trying to sort of extract themselves from the matrix, think for themselves. We're trying to find the truth of what's going on here. And I'm sure you're familiar that there's a very significant quarter that would say, oh, everything's controlled by the Rothschilds and it's all sort of one big pantomime. So how can we address that issue that would say, well, surely Trump's just dancing to the tune, you know, he's reading his script, Boris Johnson's reading his, but I mean, I don't personally buy into that theory. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I just wanted to back that one at you. I don't want to muddy the waters too much, but
no, that doesn't muddy the waters at all, because a lot of people who were originally Trump supporters have now become pessimistic. They've become beaten down. They now say you can't beat them. They're too powerful. They've either taken over Trump or Trump was an operation from the beginning. Simple point. If so, why have they spent so much effort to try and get rid of him? If Trump were part of the establishment and this was all a game, why did we have 2.5 years of the Mueller investigation, which Mueller knew after 2 months there was no collusion? And yet the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, every single day put out the same lies. They're still saying that the Russians hacked the election, even though it's been proven by Bill Binney, one of the top NSA technical people, that it was an inside job. It was not a hack. So why do they keep that up? Now, either that would be the most diabolical Rothschild conspiracy ever, or else people are just submitting to their pessimism. And I would argue that part of the operation is designed by the brainwashers at places like Tavistock Institute to figure out what are the vulnerabilities of people who believe conspiracy theories so that we can manipulate them to capitulate and sit around a bar with a beer and talk with their friends about how, gee, we thought it was good, but it isn't good. It's the same old thing. It's not the same old thing. There's a global rebellion against this establishment. We saw it with Brexit, with Trump, with the Italian situation, which was temporarily set back. Just again yesterday in Austria, where Kurz won a big victory, got more votes than last time, and it's possible he'll have the same so-called right-center coalition again. We've seen it in the Philippines and Mexico, that people are rejecting establishment parties, even here in Germany. Look, Merkel's party is collapsing. The Social Democrats are at the lowest level of popular support since Bismarck's time. No political party can put together a coalition in Germany right now that can govern. And it's a combination of a collapse of the financial system and these geostrategic confrontations. Now, we should take a moment to look at the financial system because this is really the underlying question. And there are two aspects to this. One is the Federal Reserve is pumping $50 to $70 billion a day into the so-called repo markets to allow overnight lending so corporations can meet their margin calls, basically. Now, this is now 15 days they've been doing it. It's almost $500 billion. And they're saying it's going to continue until October 10th, when magically it will clear up. Now, they're saying there's a liquidity shortage. That's why the Fed has to intervene. Well, the Fed is intervening that way to avoid going back to the quantitative easing policy, but that's the handwriting on the wall. That's what the Bank of England is doing. That's what the European Central Bank is doing. Negative interest rates. All these shenanigans are designed to do what? Have a flood of funny money going into the speculative bubble to keep it propped up. Now, within that, there is a plan. And this comes from all the leading banks. And the spokesperson for it is none other than the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who gave a speech at the UN Climate Summit last week. Well, everyone was watching this poor little abused character, Greta Thunberg, and everyone was focused on that and her theatrics. They missed the real show, which was Mark Carney going in saying, we now have a compact of 130 banks that are going to establish a disclosure system that will say that no lending can take place except for those projects that are approved by this council that are green, that all the credit will go into green projects. So they're going to take down coal, they're going to take down oil and gas, they're going to take down nuclear, they're going to take down machine tool and so on sector. Productive industry will be outlawed. And Carney said, those who go along with this system will be handsomely rewarded. Those who don't will be punished. In other words, no credit unless you invest into the green financial bubble. Now, that's the only thing they have left is zero or no interest rates and creating a green financial bubble. That was discussed at the Jackson Hole, Wyoming Federal Reserve Conference 2.5 weeks ago. That's what Carney presented at the United Nations, and it was backed up by people like Michael Bloomberg and others. So they're dealing with a collapsing financial system, growing opposition. And what are they saying now? We'll use the green policy to terrorize people into accepting austerity, higher taxes on gas and electricity, carbon taxes, carbon trading, all these crazy things that no sane person would support unless they're told by Greta, you're killing your children if you don't do this. So you have a choice. You either do it willingly or they're going to shut you down.
It's interesting to see how, these issues are interrelated. I must confess to failing to spot what was going on while the Greta Thunberg puppet show was happening. Again, another one of those great techniques we should all be aware of when something like that is happening in the news that's relatively trivial and yet a part of the big picture, to look and see what else is going on. So I appreciate your...
Nigel, very, very interesting question is being posed by some people. How is this a protest if she's supported by the major newspapers, the major corporations, the major banks? Who's she protesting?
Yeah.
She's a front piece for a global eco-fascist policy, ecological fascist policy to reduce global population.
Yeah.
That's what the Matrix is right now, is a population reduction plan that goes far beyond anything that Hitler ever did or tried to do.
How does it escape people that this policy of which you've clearly outlined there, of this reduction in energy and all this would bring about the end of our civilization as we know it? I mean, to reduce our energy consumption, by 90%, it is getting rid of fossil fuels and even nuclear. things just couldn't carry on. Aeroplanes will stop. Things just couldn't carry on in a way that we have come to take them for granted.
Well, more frightening, what happens if you don't have the energy necessary for agriculture, for shipping goods?
Yes.
How many cities are self-sufficient that they have gardens that will produce enough food and slaughterhouses to produce enough meat? But they're also saying you shouldn't eat meat, you shouldn't drive, you shouldn't take airplanes, you shouldn't even wear clothing. The Extinction Rebellion is targeting fashion shows in Paris and London and elsewhere, saying the fashion industry has too big a carbon footprint. And this is financed by some of the people in the fashion industry, like Vivienne Westwood, who's a bit of an eccentric character from your neck of the woods. So you have this craziness, and it does escape people because a lot of people know that climate change, if it is real, and I don't think it is real. There's 500 real scientists who just put out a letter saying there is no climate emergency. We've had storms before, we've had hot weather before. It's called summer. We've had droughts before. But even if there is some change in the climate, it's not caused by man. It's been going on for all of human history. Before there was a single steam engine or combustion motor, before we had a single factory on the planet. It's controlled by forces much larger that have to do with the sun, cosmic radiation, and so on. But they're using fake science to try and make people feel guilty that if you put on the air conditioning in the summer or the heat in the winter, you're killing your grandchildren. But you made the right point. If we have this kind of drastic reduction of energy throughput in the system, what Lyndon LaRouche called energy flux density, mankind has advanced to over 7 billion people because we've increased the efficiency of our energy production from burning grass and wood and charcoal and coal to the point with nuclear and with the possibility of plasma technologies and nuclear fusion to have inexhaustible supplies of energy. That's through technology. Yeah. What happens if you go backwards? This is a barbaric neo-feudal cult for which Greta is being put forward as the high priestess, but you can't really blame her because she's reading a script written by these central bankers.
Sure. How does this idea and where you just projected it's going to lead, how do the establishment, the bankers, do they, of course we can't get into their minds, but how can they not see these consequences? Obviously the elite who sit on the top of a pile, even if it's a collapsing pile of civilization, they'll do better than everybody else. But can't they see? Aren't these intelligent people? Can they not see that a civilization depends on cheap, abundant energy? And can't they see that when you look at the facts of climate change, the whole climate issue, what drives it, what can't possibly drive it, the fact that it's been warmer in the past, the fact that there's been more CO2 in the atmosphere in the past, all of these fundamental facts that just pull the rug out from underneath this false narrative. How does that stand? I sometimes grapple with that, Harley.
You're assuming that they're intelligent and rational, and that they actually care about people. That's the false assumption. But these are the same banking networks which financed Adolf Hitler, which included from the Bank of England at that time, Sir Montague Norman, the Harrimans, the Rockefellers, Prescott Bush. They funded Hitler. Did they think Hitler was a good, rational choice? No, he was going to do things they wanted, namely crush the German trade union movement, break up any potential for a French-German-Russian alliance, and would march east against the Soviet Union, which, by the way, was created by the same bankers. Yeah. Now, these are also the people who funded, starting in the 60s, the idea that the world is overpopulated.
Yeah.
That we don't produce enough food. This is the old Malthusian argument that goes back to the time of the American Revolution and Parson Thomas Malthus, who said food supply always grows less arithmetically while population geometrically. So you're always going to have food shortages and dying off. Well, that's not true. Modern science changed that. So why do these Malthusians make a recovery? Well, this is where you get to the real point. Eugenics. The idea that some people think they're inherently genetically superior. And while the Nazis openly talked about that, after World War II, that no longer was possible to be openly supporting the idea that some people are not fit to live. It's the old Darwinian or the idea survival of the fittest. That's the same idea that Julian Huxley took to UNESCO at the founding of the United Nations and said we have to reduce populations of lesser people. So they may be intelligent, but they're evil.
Yeah.
You could even say satanic with their hatred of human beings, because the obvious solution is with more people and decent healthcare, decent nutrition, and education, you're going to create more geniuses who will increase the plenty for all mankind.
Absolutely.
You start reducing that arbitrarily, and you end up with people like Prince Charles in charge of the world. And that's much more dangerous than the idea of too many people.
Yeah. It's a shame, really, that the emphasis isn't on educating people and, in schools, encouraging people to learn to think, because it is thinking and, mankind's creative potential. As you said, the ability to raise more geniuses if the whole culture were thinking more. But clearly that's not their tactic. So just to come back to tie in a few points earlier. So we've got this. We've got this faction that's trying to bring down Trump, that's trying to frustrate him in his efforts to establish better and more meaningful, workable relationships with Russia, with China. Is there a sort of I don't want to say an East-West split, but are there two, maybe three different parties? Are we seeing a global situation here where Trump is genuinely in a different camp, and we've kind of touched on that already, and you suggested that he is. There's the British establishment, the royal family, the City of London. Can you sort of give us some sort of, or give us your insight on who are the players here and how many of them are there, and just to give people a bigger picture?
Well, here's something interesting, which probably very few people know. In December of last year, 2018, the House of Lords put out a report on the U.S.-British relationship, and is the UK-U.S. special relationship still special? And what they argued in this report is that Trump is the greatest threat ever to the U.S.-UK special relationship. And they say in this report that perhaps we'll survive it if he's out in 2020. But if he's reelected, forget it.
Right.
Now, that was as close as the City of London will come to openly announcing their support for a regime change coup.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the importance of the Christopher Steele report, and as I said, Steele was very much involved in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. Steele was backed by the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearloffe, who has routinely put out fake intelligence. Who's he doing that for? This is British intelligence at its core, the City of London. Now, in the United States, much of this was coordinated through a broader cover group, the Council on Foreign Relations. And people talk about the Bilderbergers and the Trilateral Commission. It's the bankers. It's the financial networks. This goes back to the old Rockefeller-Rothschild connection. Because those were the two groups that helped set up the Council on Foreign Relations in the first place. But now you've got hundreds of think tanks that are funded with billions of dollars to put out fake intelligence, to try to convince policymakers that Russia is a permanent enemy of the United States. This is what James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence under Obama, who was Brennan's partner in the launching of the coup against Trump, Clapper gave a speech in which he said the Russians are genetically opposed to the West. He said that.
That's shocking.
This was in Australia, so he figured it wouldn't get back to the U.S. or to Russia. But these guys have this view, and it's not east-west or north-south. It's an oligarchy versus the population. They're willing to kill off Africa. They're also willing to destroy rural America, which is predominantly white. It's not racial. It's not really genetic. It's against people. And this goes back to people like Bertrand Russell, the Huxley brothers. were playing around with these ideas. Orwell, how do you manipulate people so they'll psychologically they'll embrace their own oppression?
Yeah.
Drugs, brainwashing. Bertrand Russell saying in The Impact of Science on Society in 1954, you have to teach children that snow is black, and if you repeat it enough, they'll believe it. And who in the United States goes along with this? The interconnected corporate boards, the directorates that sit on top of these global corporations that benefit handsomely from globalization, while they destroy industry in the United States and the United Kingdom. We're now seeing industry being taken down in France, Germany, and Italy as well. They don't care. Nigel, they truly are evil.
Yeah.
And if you read the reports from the Club of Rome from 50 years ago, or the latest reports from the COP21 conference in Paris, you see they talk about caring for the poor. They don't care for the poor. They're committed to wiping out 5 to 6 billion people on the planet. Yeah. So I think Prince Philip once said that, well, if there are fewer people, so what? As long as we have some people who can carry our spears on safaris.
It's dreadfully shocking, and it's misguided, isn't it? I mean, if we imagined a planet where all people are free and thinking and productive and innovating, the number of geniuses would multiply and we'd all be better off. It's a shame they're working on a false premises.
And also, if you then have a financial policy, such as the one Lyndon LaRouche designed with his so-called 4 laws, where you have a banking policy which channels credit into physical production, value-added goods production, as opposed to speculative financial instruments, securitization, and these things, then you have the situation where we don't have to worry about the funny money leading to hyperinflation, or that there won't be enough credit. There can be plenty of credit. What the Chinese are doing, and they're being attacked for their credit generation. Oh, they're creating debt traps. It's not a debt trap if the money is going to something that will produce physical goods in the future. It is a debt trap if you're borrowing today to pay off the worthless debt from yesterday, like using a credit card to pay off a mortgage. You're just creating more debt. And that's the present global Western financial system. And the Chinese are moving away from that. The Russians are moving with them. The Indians are moving with them, although slowly, because there's a British influence still in India. The Japanese are moving in that direction. The Koreans are moving in that direction.
Well, can I just interject in there? Are they moving towards a monetary system that isn't debt-based? They're not talking about sort of creating money as debt, effectively. Is it that fundamentally different, the system that they're creating?
Yes. The Chinese view is somewhat based on the Hamiltonian credit system of the United States when our nation was founded, trying to free itself from control by European lenders. And what Hamilton said is a well-managed debt is a national blessing. But he said, never take on credit without the means to repay it. So how do you repay the credit? You build things.
Create
infrastructure. That cheapens the cost of everything. It creates good jobs. It requires scientific advance. So LaRouche's idea is you have to separate commercial banks from speculators. And people want to speculate, let them speculate. But they're going to eat their own losses. They're not going to get a bailout or a bail-in. Secondly, volumes of credit at low interest to physical production done by bankers, by private local bankers, not by central bankers. Then third, a portion of that directed to infrastructure, developing new platforms of infrastructure, which are there to be developed. And then fourth, massive investment in research and development into the future technologies, fusion, space explorations, plasma energy production, and so on. If you do that, you're freed from the tyranny of central banks. You also are unleashing the best potential that exists within the human race. And that's what the Chinese, how they're thinking.
Yeah.
Now, you could say Xi Jinping is a master propagandist and he's really just setting up a Chinese imperial system. The Chinese have never really been an imperial power. They don't have that in their bones. Whereas the British, of course, the Europeans in general, and even many in the United States, the Teddy Roosevelt tradition, have that imperial tendency.
Yeah.
So, we're the clash of two systems a credit-based system for physical production versus a funny money casino system that benefits the few. That's the fight that's ongoing now.
Yeah, and is the LaRouche idea, is that basic? Is it backing this credit system with something tangible? Is it gold backed? Is he really freedom, free market, capitalism? You know, is that where he's coming from?
Well, the Hamiltonian system is not an Adam Smith, von Hayek free market system. The Hamiltonian system, though, allows for maximum freedom because you're basically making investment policy dependent on where you're going to get a real return as opposed to a short-term monetary return. You know, the idea that we need to have the freedom so people can make lots of money and put the money where they want to, that's what's created this current system, the deregulation of banking, which had central banks then favoring speculators. And we've had, since 1997, at least 4 bubbles have popped. And we're now on the verge of another bigger bubble. After 2008, we didn't learn the lesson. We kept under the argument of free market. We had to let the derivative dealers do what they're going to do, the swap dealers do what they're going to do, and so on. We now have 60% more debt in the system than we did in 2008. What LaRouche says is that the question of freedom is in the ability of mankind to increase the standard of living for a growing population. And within that, people are free to do what they want to do. If someone wants to speculate, fine. Let them take the loss. You know, we're not going to take speculators out and shoot them, although the Chinese might do that. But that's not the idea.
No.
But here you have in the so-called free market system, what did Mark Carney say in New York? He said, either you invest in green technology or you'll be cut off from credit. Is that a free system?
Yeah, well, we don't have a free market at the moment, though, do we? I mean, that needs to be identified in our current mixed economy. We can't look at examples around and about today and point to them examples of why freedom and a free market doesn't work because we don't have a free market.
A totally free market won't work. A market where individuals can make rational decisions where to invest money and have access to credit, that's the maximum freedom you can have in a society. And who determines where the credit goes? Well, that's you have a treasury of the United States. This was Hamilton's idea that responds to demands from Congress. And Congress is elected by the people. So in modern society, you could still do that. You have our current Congress is a joke because of all the money coming in from especially the banks and financial institutions and corporations. But if you had an electorate that was aware of what was happening, that was educated, that knew what was going on, that was then making the decisions through their elected representatives as to where credit should go. We need infrastructure. Why aren't we investing in infrastructure? Because it doesn't have an immediate return. Well, does it benefit people to sit in traffic jams and drive off bridges that collapse? Of course not. So who's making these decisions? They're being made by bankers and insurance companies who control the legislative branches. You have the same thing in the United Kingdom. I mean, does the parliament really represent the interests of the people? So, you know, the idea of the free market of Adam Smith is a false ideology. What Hamilton showed and what the United States has demonstrated is when we've had Hamiltonian policies, we've had rates of growth from the 3, 4, 5% range, where you can then invest low interest credit and make enough money that you can save for your future, that you can sustain a retirement program. We have a lot to do in the United States to make it a true Hamiltonian system. But what we've done instead since 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off gold, is we've gone into a casino economy. Yeah. Now, you asked about gold. I don't know for sure how this would work, but what LaRouche proposed is that you take the 4 leading powers in the world now, Russia, India, China, and the United States, get an agreement among them for a fixed exchange rate. Because what Nixon did, besides taking the dollar off gold in 1971, by the way, under threats from the British, is he ended the fixed exchange rate system, which opened the door for people like George Soros and speculators to destroy economies by speculating on currencies And then they extended that to speculation on everything, including your home, with the mortgage-backed securities and so on. What LaRouche said is if you have fixed exchange rates, then you take away that option of speculating on currencies, which means that you don't worry about currency manipulation in the case of U.S.-China trade. You can begin to then move towards something tangible behind the currency, maybe a gold reserve system to get it started. Not a gold standard, where it's $1 credit for $1 gold, but gold reserve. But that you then it's backed by the physical production of an economy, as opposed to pledges of bankers to guarantee absolutely unsustainable levels of debt. Now, we need a debt moratorium along with that. Freeze or write down huge volumes of debt, the quadrillions of dollars in funny money that's out there. But LaRouche's system is based on what's called the American system of physical economy, which is a little bit like what the Chinese are trying to do with their investment policy. So we don't have it yet. There's not a model of that, except how the Hamiltonian system or the Lincoln system or what was being done by John F. Kennedy when he was assassinated, by getting the Treasury rather than the Federal Reserve to be the source of credit.
I'm not sure I agree that a free market is not the solution. I'm a bit of a free marketeer, but we can leave that point aside. When we look at these other factions in the world, then we look at Russia, China, and the other maneuverings. Do you see them as a completely separate camp from this old British geopolitical system? Are they our rivals? Is that sort of a rival oligarchy? Is that the way you see it, or do you see it, the old British Empire? And I wouldn't want to imply that Russia and China are whiter than white. There are problems and there's corruption all over the place. But generally speaking, do you think that those nations are being more rational and more forward thinking and not necessarily trying to just bolt things down to the way they've been, ever since, or the last couple of 100 years? How do you view these different factions?
Well, China's definitely going in a different direction. Russia, there's still a fight because the Russians have a certain number of people in their central bank who have a foot in the old British system, who want to have an open banking system. One of the fights between China and the U.S. on trade is that people like Lighthizer and Peter Navarro, two of the top trade representatives for Trump, are insisting that China open their banking system. And why do they want to do that? Well, China's sitting on a huge pile of dollars. China has a huge pile of gold. They want to get their hands on that. They want to open up the Chinese banking system to take those dollars out of there and put them in the financial bubble to keep the bubble going. Now, the Chinese don't want to do that. There are some people in Russia who are inclined that way, but there are others who are not. And the Russians are sort of hedging it because they have oil and gas, they have potential strategic metals in Siberia, but they're also buying a lot of gold. So I think what we're seeing is, rather than different camps the way Halford Mackinder and the old-style geopoliticians would see it, is you have two paradigms. Right. One is a paradigm of the current system, to maintain the power of central bankers. And I would say on this free trade thing, we can obviously discuss that at another point, free market. But when you have central bankers who have the control over monetary policy, and at Jackson Hole, what Carney and then the BlackRock people proposed is the central bankers should also control fiscal policy, take it out of the hands of elected representatives. This was a paper delivered by BlackRock that had 4 former central bankers, including Hildebrand of the Swiss Central Bank, Stanley Fischer of the Israeli Central Bank and the Federal Reserve. They proposed that you have what they called a financial regime change. So you take away the power of elected governments and put it in the hands of bankers who are the experts and who know what to do. And I talked to one leading economist who said, are these the same experts who ran up the 2008 crisis? Are they the ones who controlled things after that? That's who we're going to trust? But that's the paradigm that presently exists, the so-called independent central bankers who only have the interests of the people in their monetary policy at heart. And they want to grab fiscal policy. That must not happen. Otherwise, why elect governments? It's like the European Parliament. Why elect the European Parliament? It's actually Juncker and a handful of flunkies who make the policy based on what the City of London and Frankfurt want, as opposed to what the people in Italy and Spain and Croatia are voting for. Mm-hmm. So do we really want representative democracy, or do we want bankers' dictatorship? Those are the two paradigms. Now, is China a representative democracy? No. They've got a ways to go. But did they lift 800 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades? Yes, they did. Are they improving the conditions of the average person in China? Yes, they did. Whereas in the West, are we plunging more people into poverty? Which we are. Yeah. And so I think you can see the two different paradigms.
Indeed. So if we bring the sort of polarization of Brexit back into it, the idea of the European superstate versus the factions and the people that would prefer to see the United Kingdom independent through a Brexit. What's going on with this? I mean, where are the European superstate? You alluded to the fact there that Juncker is accepting instructions from the City of London. How do people overlay information like that with what we see on the ground between this sort of possibly pantomime staged struggle to extricate Britain from the EU? And then there are those that say, well, we've left already because of the legal the legislation in place and dates passed and stuff. And there are those that say we're never going to leaving with a deal, of course, leaving a treaty with another treaty isn't leaving anything. So how do you reconcile this European superstate camp, if I can use that word, with the British establishment and the City of London? Are they actually opposed, or are they playing some sort of dance before our eyes to distract us from something else?
Well, that's a big question, but let me just give you a hint. One of the issues that the European Union had to deal with if Britain leaves the EU is, what about British banking? What about the role of the City of London, which is a pivotal center of the EU? For example, there are 3 major clearinghouses for the derivative trade that control something like $49 trillion worth of derivatives that they either certify are good or not good, and based on the certification, they can be traded. And the clearinghouses supposedly guarantee that they can be backed up, which is impossible. Well, the EU granted to the 3 clearinghouses the right to continue to function as the clearinghouses for EU derivatives trade. And when they were asked, well, will you change the law to reflect that? They said, no, just disregard the law. So this is the so-called European superstate making a pragmatic decision on how to sustain a banker's dictatorship. Look, the EU was sold on false pretenses, that we're going to have liberal democracy, we're going to have partnership, brotherhood, free trade, so we'll never have a war again. Now, to do it, we have to suppress the desire of individual countries to act on their own, take away their sovereignty. Why? Because national sovereignty, in the lingo of the liberal democracy of the EU, national sovereignty leads to Nazism, to total state nationalism against the other.
Another debatable assumption, yeah.
Yeah, that's just not true. And if you take away national sovereignty, then why have local governments? Why have elected governments if you're going to give people like Juncker, who was never elected by anybody, control over what happens in Liverpool or in Marseille? You're taking away a right that's been fought for over centuries for the people of Europe. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't have a free trade zone that would work, but that's not what the EU is. The free trade zone is sort of the sucker bait to make sure that no country has the right to act on its own, whether it's on immigration policy, retirement funds, medical care. All these things now have to be centralized and dictated out of Brussels. And that doesn't work. It's proven that it doesn't work. Look at Spain, look at Greece, look at Portugal, look at Italy. Now, Could that still work within an EU? You'd have to change the charter, I think. But the original idea of a common Europe was de Gaulle's idea of a federation of nation states, sovereign nation states, that can have disagreements, but are working for the better of the other. And now what you have is the idea that you're not allowed your disagreements because we, the bureaucrats, know what's best. And I think that's why the people of the United Kingdom voted for Brexit, because they didn't want a bunch of Eurocrats, including British Eurocrats, telling them what to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the City of London has cut a deal with the EU so they can function either within or outside of Brexit. I mean, within the EU or outside of the EU. So they feel strongly both ways. And then you have someone like Boris Johnson, who's trying to adhere, at least as he says, to the vote of the people. And he's being ridiculed and attacked and stymied at every turn.
Well, one of the most shocking things, I think, was watching the United Kingdom Parliament creating legislation to prevent a no-deal Brexit. I mean, what is going on there? You know, it somewhat frustrates me as an observer when I hear all this deal, no deal, and the idea, as I alluded to before, of you know, signing a treaty to negotiate your departure. It it seems a contradiction in terms entirely.
Well, the idea is we'll let you vote as long as you choose what we want. And if you don't, we'll have another option, and that's what happened to Italy.
Yeah, but I mean, will the British people put up with that? I mean, because I mean, obviously we can only speculate, but there does seem to be a rising sentiment of frustration with the establishment at not listening to the people. You know, there are a lot of people that I've spoken to that are almost hardened their pro-Brexit line as a result of all of this pantomime and shenanigans, 3 years of delay, and it seems to be more and more clear that you know, the establishment through Parliament doesn't want us to leave the EU. That's. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. It seems to be.
That's definitely. I mean, look, they basically don't want a rebellion against the EU. They're trying to suppress it. Look at the Yellow Vest movement in France. You know, the French police treated the Yellow Vest protesters worse than the Hong Kong police treated the Hong Kong protesters. Yet we hear constantly about, the violence in Hong Kong. We don't hear about Macron's people shooting rubber bullets into people's heads in France. So, you know, there's a line there. And look at Salvini, what happened to him. This was they call it the Ursula coup, where they put in this nobody from Germany, Ursula von der Leyen, to be the next Commission president. And she went behind the backs of the people, the parties in Italy, to negotiate bringing in a technocratic government that will reverse what was the results of the last election. And then to make it worse, they won't allow a new election. Because if they did have a new election, Salvini would probably surpass the 40% level, and the Lega would be the government there. So they've learned the lesson of Brexit, which is to, if you have to have an election, figure out how to sabotage it.
Do you see somebody like Boris Johnson? You know, obviously he looks quite good from the sort of the Remainer camp, the sovereign people who'd rather see England as a sovereign nation. He looks good in that he's appears to be fighting for the will of the people. But to what extent do you think is he script reading? Is this all part of a pantomime? How confident can the onlookers that are trying to extricate themselves from this sort of matrix, this cultural download of what to think, and try to think independently, how can those people make sense of this in the light of the counter argument that he's just a puppet, you know, throw your hands in the air and just you know, a whole concept of government is the problem?
I guess we'll find out in 32 days.
Yeah.
The deadline's coming up. Is he serious about taking Britain out? And of course, these scare stories of there'll be shortages of food, shortages of medicine. I mean, there are things that governments can do to protect the people and under those circumstances, but they better get moving because they have 31 or 32 days now.
Also, there's the fact that, you know, if he's sort of shaking hands and he's in the same sort of clubs with all these people in Parliament that have created the legislation to prevent Brexit with no deal behind the scenes, if that were going on, of course, you know, his what he's trying to achieve, the Brexit, if it's blocked anyway, it's quite safe for him to be seen and to be posturing as a champion of the people, safe in the knowledge that what he's arguing for is impossible anyway, because the other side are going to make sure it doesn't happen. I mean, I may be reading too much into it.
Well, I don't know, Nigel. Let me ask you this. I still can't figure out how the EU can claim that Britain has to pay to get out of the treaty. That makes no sense. You've already paid as part of the EU over the years. And, in some ways it probably benefited the people of the United Kingdom. In some ways it benefited the people of Europe. And in some ways it took away their power. So now the people are saying we're willing to go on our own. And I think Johnson is partly betting that he'll be able to get an agreement with Trump, a trade agreement with Trump, and maybe an agreement with some of the countries, individual countries of Europe, but I'm assuming the EU will stand in the way of that. The other thing that's interesting, and watch this in the background, and it's screwed up by the Hong Kong thing, because the British are pretty much taking the line that China's bad in Hong Kong, and you've got a free Hong Kong as it was freed under British colonialism. But what's the argument behind that? The British are doing everything they can to become the center of Chinese yuan trading. The major outlet for yuan convertibility in Europe is London. And so maybe there'll be a shift by the British while the EU is being very skeptical about China. Maybe something will change in Britain. I'm not sure. But I think he's got to have a certain lifeline from Trump, maybe from China, maybe from Russia. Otherwise, there probably will be chaos. And don't underestimate the ability or the willingness of bankers to set off a new civil war in England. I've been looking back at the whole period of Cromwell and what was unleashed there around, what rights do Parliament have? And, this is some of the same language that's coming up again today. And parties breaking up, alliances, allegiances falling apart. This is what we see. Labor can't step in because Labor is very confused and duplicitous on the Brexit question.
I struggle to understand why so many, indeed, if it's genuine, why so many people out there would argue that for a nation such as the United Kingdom to break away from the European superstate, how that could cause such calamitous bad news. I mean, obviously there could be some disruption at ports and with trade in the short term, but the ability of a sovereign nation to strike a deal with the other sovereign nations of the world to come up with trade deals, how can that be perceived as a bad news scenario? How can they present the fact that leaving this cliquey trading club is going to result in doom and gloom for everybody? I mean, there are no facts of reality that I'm aware of that would back up such a proposition.
Well, that's where finance comes in, because the City of London was instrumental initially in setting up the EU. And the City of London had a lot to say about the role of Germany, for example. That Thatcher prevailed upon Mitterrand and Bush that the only terms under which Germany would be allowed to reunify would be that they would underwrite the euro for the poorer nations of the South, which is a huge problem for Germany. The Germans said, we don't want a transfer union, but that's exactly what happened. And Germany's sitting there now still dependent on EU policy to get their debts repaid from Greece, Spain, Italy, and so on. Now, who is overseeing that? London. All the German banks moved to London. The reason Deutsche Bank is such a mess is that they moved their trading division to London and made that the center of the bank. And now they're saying, oh, what do? We have 47 trillion in derivative debt and we can't make money anymore. What do we do? Well, go back to being a commercial bank. Yeah. But what happened is they all got interconnected through the short-term benefits by being connected to the City of London. So it's not so much sovereign Britain that's threatened if they would leave the EU, it's the financial system. And the financial system is imploding.
Yeah.
And the debt, the volume of debt has grown enormously. Look, you just had Thomas Cook go under.
Yeah.
Had a bus company, I think, in Northern Ireland go under. There are many, many potential dominoes that can fall that are related to derivative trading. Yeah. And this is not about Brexit. This is about the financial system.
Okay. Well, thank you for bringing some clarity to that. That's, certainly in my mind, and hopefully in the mind of any listeners. I think you've joined quite a few dots and illustrated the interconnection and the fact that it's fundamentally the monetary system that's in trouble, and the desire to bring in this rather grotesque replacement that you were describing earlier. It all sounds rather horrendous.
And what do? They blame the people. They say, oh, the people were irresponsible by voting for Brexit. The people were irresponsible for wanting to eat meat and drive cars and have a certain amount of freedom. It's your fault.
Yeah, shocking.
I saw the chief economist from Deutsche Bank some years ago was asked about what happened in 2008, and he said, you caused it because you were greedy, not the bankers. So I think that's what we're up against, a system that's entrenched but in deep trouble, and scrambling for every penny they can find.
Wonderful. Well, Harley, thank you so much for a wonderful, again, concise and clear snapshot of things. Joining dots, as I said, and marvelous. I'm aware of time, so we better zip it up here. I'd urge all you listeners to visit the website lawfulrebel.com for more information on how we can thrive. Also catch Harley via the Schiller Institute and larouchepack.com. Harley, thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Also, Nigel, if people would like to get, I post on my blog page every week an article. I just sent you two of the ones from yesterday.
Yeah.
If people would like to regularly get my emails announcing when I'm posting something, send me an email to my personal email, and I'll send you the link so you can do that. So that's harleysch@gmail.com. And if you want to dispute things or argue or discuss things or share ideas, you can do that through harleysch@gmail.com.
Wonderful stuff. Excellent. And once again, thank you so much, Harley, and thank you for listening. And I hope you'll all join us once again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.